Center for American Security co-chairman and former national security advisor to Vice President Pence. General, great to see you again. Thank you for being here. Do you have any idea whether there is a coherent strategy in dealing with this situation?
Well, first of all, David, thanks for having me. The quick answer is no. I don't think they've thought their way through it. I really don't. You know, when he makes comments like that, he's kind of showing his soul. When he talked about it during the press conference about a minor incursion, he kind of gave away the farm. He basically told everybody, I really don't have a plan to counter what Putin's trying to do and really haven't thought my way through it. Look, the big day is going to be Friday. Friday is the day that we are supposed to respond in writing to demands that Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, gave to Secretary of State Blinken a week ago. And he put it in the form of a recommended treaty. And the most important part of that is going to be the fourth article in that document, says no more eastward movement of NATO. And that means no NATO engagement with Ukraine. And so he's kind of said this is going to be the key point. That's going to be the sticking point. I think if we say, you know, forget it, we're not even going to talk about that, I think this is going to cause him to really think hard, he being Putin, about coming south into Ukraine and cutting about 1/3 of that country off. Because right now, and you know, we could finesse it if we wanted to, David. We could say, look, Ukraine's not going to become part of NATO because, frankly, they're probably one of the most corrupt nations in the world, or in the bottom third of nations, and the only other more corrupt nation in Europe happens to be Russia. But we're going to have to finesse it. And if we don't do that on finessing and saying, well, it's not going to happen in the short term, meaning they become a NATO partner because all 30 countries in NATO have to agree, and there's a lot of countries that don't want them in there, then I think we're looking at an invasion coming south.
But, General, I hear him being, and there's no other word for it, being flippant about deployment of troops, and with no specificity about where, how many, and the most important thing, what their mission would be. I mean, you send troops in without a clear mission, and you're in trouble, right?
Yeah. Well, he passed the buck. You know, when they had these, when you had your spokesman from the Pentagon saying, well, we're going to leave it up to NATO to determine the mission with the reaction force of NATO. I mean, I heard that. I said, what? That means we really haven't even thought this out. And they haven't told us the type of units. They've made this general comment. Well, they're medical units or the logistics units. What kind of combat units are willing to send into NATO to reinforce? And where exactly are you going to put these forces? You notice we haven't said any of that. It's kind of a finesse move, and that just is telling me they really don't know what they're doing.
Well, and if you deploy, General, if you do, I'm speaking to the converted. I mean, you know a lot more about this than I do. But when you put troops in, when you deploy troops without a mission, don't they just become cannon fodder? I mean, they need a clear mission before they go in, which, by the way, includes an exit. I haven't even heard the entrance, but I'm hearing, nevertheless, this vague talk about deployments.
Yeah, I think this is just, that's all it is, David, is talk. He's trying to do, he meaning President Biden, is trying to do something. So it sounds good when you send troops. But you're right, there's no mission for them. What are they going to do? And Putin's not listening to that. No. He knows that doesn't mean anything. It's really a hollow gesture on the part of the president. He knows it, you know it, I know it, and more importantly, Putin knows it as well.
Well, and there's certain things that Putin has heard, and he is listening. He's listening, and his people are listening, and they are hearing things. And one of those things they heard was that phrase, minor incursion. It's, you know, basically the President Biden saying if it's just a minor incursion, you know, the sanctions won't be that bad, et cetera. Then his aides, Jen Psaki and others, tried to walk that back. But it was out there. You can't, you know, it's the old expression, you can't unsee it. There's certain things you can't unhear. And Putin's not going to unhear that phrase, is he?
No. Look, if you pull out a map of Ukraine, I can give you the minor incursion. If you look at the map of Ukraine and you look at what's called the Dnieper River, that's the eastern part of Ukraine. This minor incursion, if he comes in, that's the minor incursion. He's going to take the eastern 1/3 of Ukraine, which has got a boundary of the Dnieper River, and it makes a lot of sense to me because that is really where the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine is. If that's what he wants to do, that's what he's going to do. I think there's a chance we can come to some type of solution with him, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on it. I think in the near term, he really wants to come forward. And when he does that, David, I really think it's going to start to break apart NATO.
Wouldn't he also, though, we only have about 20 seconds, wouldn't he also be interested in getting the capital, in getting the seat of government? As you suggest, there are problems with corruption, there are problems with whether they have control over their own forces, et cetera. Isn't it something that you think Putin would like to have, like to be able to control that country from the capital itself?
Yeah, he might want to do it, but that's almost it's too hard to do. When you start to occupy cities, armies don't want to go into cities. You know, I remember that we went into Baghdad. That's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Stay out of your cities the best you can.
But he doesn't necessarily have to occupy it. I mean, he can
Right.
always put a proxy in. It's happened before in the Ukraine, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that part's very true, David. He can do that. And that's in probability what he would do. And there's a lot of proxies you can turn to. Even Poroshenko is back in there right now. So the probability of that is there. It can happen, yes.
What a mess. General Kellogg, thank you very much, General. Appreciate it.